Think you got the Roman Empire all figured out? Spoiler, a lot of what you know is more Hollywood than history. So grab your laurels and your sandals and let's bust 5 myths about the Roman Empire you probably still believe. Number 1, gladiators fought to the death. When you think of ancient Rome, you probably imagine the Colosseum soaked in blood, with gladiators battling to the death on a daily basis, while an entire city cheered them on. Sounds intense, right? Well, that's mostly Hollywood talking. In reality, according to historian Eric Tassier, one of the leading specialists on Roman gladiators, the idea that most gladiatorial combats ended in death is largely a misconception. Gladiators were not disposable. They were investments. Think about it like this. Would you send Lionel Messi or LeBron James onto the field just to have them killed for the crowd? No way. Gladiators were highly trained athletes, expensive to acquire and even more expensive to maintain. They lived in gladiator schools, ludi, where they were carefully trained, fed, and kept in top shape because their value was in their ability to fight again. Of course, fights were dangerous. These were still brutal combat sports, but the ultimate goal wasn't necessarily to kill. It was to entertain. The myth that every match was a death match simply isn't true. In fact, many gladiators developed a fan base, won prizes, and fought dozens of times over the course of their careers. The real death sentence matches were usually reserved for criminals, prisoners of war, or condemned slaves, not the prized, well-trained gladiators you see in movies. There was also a whole business model behind gladiatorial games. Gladiators were often owned by lanistae, managers of gladiator schools, who essentially rented them out to organizers of games, much like modern sports agents. These managers had a vested interest in keeping their fighters alive and building their reputation, not seeing them slaughtered. And by the way, staging these games was incredibly costly. Politicians used them as a way to buy popularity with the masses, which is why they were usually tied to religious festivals, major celebrations, or important political campaigns, not daily events. But one thing is certain. When it came to entertainment, they never held back. In fact, they loved it so much that the spectacles weren't limited to gladiator fights. According to ancient sources like Suetonius and modern scholars such as John Humphrey, the Colosseum and similar arenas were used for a variety of shows. One of the most legendary, though still debated, was the Naumachia, or staged naval battles. Some sources claim that Emperor Caligula, and later, possibly Titus, flooded the arena to recreate ship battles as public spectacles. However, modern historians like Humphrey and others have noted that the logistics of fully flooding the Colosseum are highly questionable. It's more likely that smaller-scale water displays or mock naval scenes took place in specially constructed basins or earlier venues. Beyond that, the Romans also hosted animal hunts called venationes, public executions, acrobatics, and even theatrical performances within the amphitheaters. The Colosseum wasn't just a death arena. It was Rome's all-in-one Netflix, zoo, and football stadium. So, no, ancient Rome wasn't a 24/7 death arena. Gladiator games were occasional, carefully staged events, and gladiators weren't just cannon fodder. They were more like today's star athletes with adoring fans, lucrative careers, and yes, sometimes even their own merch. Number 2, all Romans wore togas all the time. When we picture ancient Romans, the first image that pops into most people's heads is probably a bunch of guys lounging around in white togas, sipping wine, and dramatically quoting philosophy. But here's the reality check. Most Romans didn't wear togas in daily life at all. The toga was actually a formal ceremonial garment, not the ancient version of sweatpants. It was worn mainly by Roman male citizens during public events, political ceremonies, or religious festivals. And even then, it wasn't exactly a fashion dream. The toga was this huge, heavy piece of fabric, sometimes up to 6 meters long, that you had to carefully drape around your body in a very specific way. Honestly, it was more complicated to put on than your favorite modern-day outfit with 3 zippers and no instructions. Most Romans, especially those going about their daily routines, wore something much simpler, the tunica. The tunic was the ancient equivalent of a comfy t-shirt dress. Easy to wear, easy to work in, and perfect for a day at the market, in the fields, or just hanging out at the bathhouse. Roman women usually wore a stola, a long sleeveless dress, over their tunic. In fact, wearing a toga every day would have been like showing up to the supermarket in a tuxedo. It was a statement piece, not everyday wear. Even Roman writers like Juvenal joked about how awkward and cumbersome the toga was. In fact, it was so impractical that even Roman elites often ditched it in favor of more comfortable clothes unless they had to wear it. Another fun detail? Different types of togas were used to communicate social status. For example, the toga praetexta, with a purple border, was worn by magistrates and some priests. The toga candida, bright white, was worn by political candidates, hence the word candidate. The toga pulla, dark-colored, was worn during mourning. But the average Roman? They weren't rocking togas at the bakery or the gladiator games. Number 3, the Roman Empire was entirely built on slavery. When we think of the Roman Empire, the image of armies of slaves building cities, rowing ships, and serving banquets often comes to mind. It's a popular vision in movies and TV shows, but it seriously oversimplifies Roman society. Yes, slavery was a significant part of the Roman world. Slaves worked in households, on farms and mines, and even as teachers and accountants. Enslaved people were war captives, debtors, or those born into slavery. But here's the twist. The Roman Empire wasn't solely powered by slaves. In fact, a huge portion of Roman economic life was driven by free people, the middle class, merchants, artisans, and small farmers, who were the real backbone of the day-to-day Roman economy. The Roman economy was diverse and layered. It wasn't just rich aristocrats sitting on couches while slaves did literally everything. It's also worth noting that slavery in Rome wasn't a permanent life sentence in every case. Many slaves, especially those in urban areas, could eventually buy their freedom or be freed by their owners. Once freed, they became freedmen or freedwomen and could build successful lives, start businesses, and even accumulate wealth. Some freedmen became incredibly rich and influential. Imagine that, a former slave could end up running an entire shipping company in Rome. Oh, and one more thing to debunk. The classic image of Roman galleys packed with chained slaves rowing to the crack of a whip? That's pure Hollywood fiction. In reality, the Roman Navy mostly relied on paid professionals, free men, and soldiers as rowers. Skilled rowers were essential in naval combat, where timing, coordination, and sheer stamina could decide a battle, and enslaved people simply couldn't be trusted to perform with the same motivation, especially under life or death pressure. Now, to be fair, there were extremely rare emergencies where slaves were used to fill the benches, but even then, they weren't chained. In fact, those who rowed in such desperate situations were often granted their freedom afterward as a reward for their service. Rome clearly understood that offering citizenship, pay, and upward mobility made a far more effective crew than fear and chains. And while the empire did benefit from forced labor, particularly in agriculture and mining, the economy couldn't have functioned without the millions of free citizens who worked, traded, paid taxes, and served in the military. In fact, the Roman middle class, especially in cities like Pompeii, was bustling. You had shop owners, bakers, blacksmiths, tavern keepers, and all kinds of tradespeople making the economy spin. Archaeological evidence, like from Pompeii and Herculaneum, shows entire neighborhoods full of these kinds of small businesses. Number 4, the Roman Empire fell in 476 AD. This one is more well-known than the previous myths, but I'm pretty sure some of you still think the Roman Empire came crashing down in 476 AD, right? When the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was overthrown by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer? Sounds dramatic, doesn't it? Like a sudden, blockbuster ending to one of the greatest empires in history. Truth, the fall of Rome wasn't some one-day disaster. It was more like a long, slow fade-out, a centuries-long decline packed with political chaos, economic troubles, and relentless invasions. By the time 476 AD rolled around, the Western Roman Empire was already a shadow of its former self. The capital had moved, borders were shrinking, and internal problems were tearing it apart bit by bit. Meanwhile, over in the East, the Roman Empire was far from finished. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, thrived for nearly 1,000 more years. Constantinople stood strong as a political, cultural, and economic powerhouse until it fell in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks. So really, 476 AD wasn't the fall of Rome. It was more like the Western half's game over screen, while the Eastern half hit continue. Rome as an idea and an empire transformed and evolved rather than vanished overnight. If you want to dig deeper, historians like Edward Gibbon in The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and modern scholars like Peter Heather in The Fall of the Roman Empire have done incredible work unraveling this slow-motion epic. So yeah, Rome didn't fall in a day, it just changed the channel and kept the show running in the East for centuries. Number 5. Rome was always the capital of the Roman Empire. Most of us picture Rome as the permanent, unshakable heart of the empire. You know, Caesar giving speeches in the Forum, senators in togas scheming in marble halls. But here's the twist. Rome wasn't always the capital. In fact, Rome lost its capital status long before the Western Empire even fell. At first, Rome was the undisputed center of everything: politics, culture, military power. But as the empire grew into a massive superstate stretching from Britain to Egypt, it simply became impossible to manage from one city. The Roman emperors realized this logistical nightmare and made some bold changes. In 286 CE, Emperor Diocletian came in with a new plan: divide and conquer. Not enemies, he divided the empire itself. He split it into the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire to make it easier to govern. Diocletian himself set up his headquarters in Nicomedia, modern-day Izmit in Turkey, while his co-emperor ran the western half from Mediolanum, which you might know today as Milan. Yep, Milan, not Rome. But the big shift came later. In 330 CE, Constantine the Great officially established Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. And this was no temporary setup. Constantinople would remain the empire's power center for over 1,000 years, long after Rome itself had fallen to invading tribes. Even the Western Roman Empire didn't stay in Rome forever. In its final stretch, the Western emperors moved the capital to Ravenna. Why? Because Ravenna was surrounded by marshes, and let's be honest, if you're an emperor watching your empire fall apart, you want your last stronghold to be as hard to invade as possible. So Rome may have kicked off the empire's story, but it didn't get to host the after party. If you just learned something new, smash that like button and subscribe. Don't let these facts collapse like ancient Rome.